Vice President Mike Pence turns his focus to Ecuador today as part of his official trip to Latin America. He's working to get support in the region to pressure Venezuela's socialist government, which he says is responsible for a humanitarian crisis. Upon his arrival in Ecuador, the vice president visited a migrant facility to meet families who have fled from Venezuela.
Are you doing okay?
Pence, accompanied by his wife Karen, listened to the stories of some of the refugees. Venezuela's economy is in a deep depression, and shortages of food and medicine have forced 2 million people to leave the country. Pence is hammering Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, whose failed leadership he blamed for Venezuela's crisis.
Venezuela was once a beacon of prosperity and freedom in the New World. But under Nicolas Maduro, Venezuela's great democracy has been reduced by a brutal dictatorship.
Maduro recently won a second term in an election condemned as illegitimate by the U.S. and other foreign governments. It's a key issue the vice president is discussing with Ecuador's president, Lenin Moreno. Pence's visit to Ecuador comes one day after a stop in Brazil, where he visited a similar refugee camp housing Venezuelans.
We stand with you, and we will keep standing with you until democracy is restored in Venezuela.
Pence says the U.S. will give nearly $10 million to support Venezuelan migrants, a little over $1 million of which will go to Brazil. In addition to the crisis in Venezuela, the vice president is also talking with Latin American leaders about issues like commerce, security, and defense. He will meet next with the presidents of Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador to address the migrant crisis at the U.S.-Mexico border. Joining me for a closer look at the issues is Anna Quintana, Senior Policy Analyst for Latin America and the Western Hemisphere at the Heritage Foundation. Anna, welcome back to the program.
Thanks for having me.
The Vice President is talking about applying pressure to the Maduro government by trying to isolate that. Do you think other Latin American governments are going to get on board with this idea?
I mean, they've been on board, right? So since the start of the Trump administration, they've rallied the region. They really have an unprecedented amount of countries supporting the U.S. effort and supporting, other countries' efforts, like the Mexican government's efforts to diplomatically isolate the Maduro regime. So they cannot count on the legitimacy of having Latin America supporting them. They don't have that anymore.
Obviously, the concern is for the people who still live in Venezuela, are still there. Is there a concern that putting more pressure like this, economic pressure and others, could do more harm than good for the people who live under Maduro?
The economic pressure that's being applied right now are targeted sanctions against corrupt government officials in the Venezuelan government. People who have been complicit in drug trafficking, who've been complicit in destroying the country's democracy. There has not been a single sanction applied to the economy. In fact, virtually every country in Latin America has supported bringing humanitarian aid to the Venezuelan government and to the people, but the Maduro regime refuses to accept it.
Well, speaking of humanitarian aid, I had mentioned that more than $1 million of aid has been promised to Brazil to help with the influx of Venezuelans coming in there. Is it a wise move to give the Brazilian government that much money, noting that they've kind of had their own problems with corruption?
It appears that way, right? The Brazilians clearly have had their issues, but it's in Brazil's interest right now to directly support the refugees that are coming from Venezuela. I mean, they're Venezuela's land neighbor. It's a natural source for the Venezuelans who are fleeing their country, and I would imagine that amount of money, they're not going to misuse it, and they recognize that Venezuela is a priority for the Trump administration. They're going to continue collaborating with the United States on it.
Yeah, they know they're watching.
Exactly.
I want to turn this week, switch gears a little bit to the presidential elections in Mexico,
yes,
because there are 4 candidates running, but Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador seems to really be the front runner. He seems to be right now. So what is it about his candidacy that seems to be resonating with voters?
Polls have him at about 52% right now. So, I mean, barring anything catastrophic, he's going to be elected on Sunday. And what seems to resonate with the Mexican population is he represents something completely different than from the traditional two-party system, right? The Mexican people, the vast majority of the people, feel as though the political and the economic elite have failed them. They failed to deliver on security. They failed to improve the economy. Last year was Mexico's most violent year, and they want to change. And, it sounds controversial, but there's so many similarities between AMLO and President Trump in that sense, that they want to fix the political system because the establishment clearly is not working.
Well, how would a win then for him affect relations between Mexico and the United States, especially on the issue like immigration?
On the immigration front, I think things are going to be tricky. AMLO he's much more nationalist. He's clearly very supportive of the Mexican people's, what he determines to be their right to migrate. Clearly that that's not where President Trump is. I hope there's a lot of areas. I hope that they can focus on the areas in which they agree, on issues like security, on economic development. I think on the immigration side of things, things might get tricky, but I hope that AMLO recognizes that it's both in the U.S. and Mexican government's interest to maintain stable and warm relations.
So many important issues we'll be watching in Latin America over the next several days. Anna Quintana, Senior Policy Analyst for Latin America and the Western Hemisphere at the Heritage Foundation. Thanks so much for your analysis.
Thank you.